Right. So what we'll do for the rest of the time is basically throw the floor open and see if anybody has any questions and see if we can get some kind of discussion going. So does anybody have any thoughts? Yes. So if you could just start by saying your name and where you're from.
Sure. David Myers, P-Media Associates. Question for you, just on your last slide about adding the pay-per-view options. Mm-hmm. Does your technology allow for A/B testing or on the fly? So you had, I can't remember the exact numbers, 5, 15, 35 or something like that.
Yeah.
And, maybe as an article just gets published, you can have a higher rate and then a week later have a lower rate. I mean, do you have that functionality, and maybe you can discuss about technology and functionality in that vein as a general concept?
Yeah. Did everybody get the question? Do I need to repeat it? We all good? All right. Excellent. So yes. So that's a very interesting question. Is the ability to do things like A/B testing, to do things like trying to sketch out the elasticity curve, for example, of a purchase, and the answer is that yes, we can do that. And in actual fact, in the early days of working with Nature Publishing Group, with Nature.com, on creating an e-commerce solution, or a pay-per-view solution, we actually tested a variety of different price points and looked at the conversion rates for those price points and kind of figured out, where we should be pricing things in order to kind of, maximize revenue and kind of sketch out the elasticity curve. So yeah, it's absolutely possible to vary price points, to change price points based on journals, to do all sorts of different things, to change the types of purchase, the types of access tier that it is, the restrictions and all sorts of things. There's a very broad range of experimentation. We have quite a bit of experience now, having done several of these trials, on what works and what doesn't work, and what people see value in and what they're prepared to pay for. So absolutely, yeah, we're very much up for the idea of experimenting with the different ways in which we can create new value props with the technology. So right at the back, yes.
Hi, this is a question for Grace, actually. You talked earlier about some of your products, the most successful ones are those down to individual editors, and I just wondered, that's something we've definitely discovered as well from IRA publishing, whether you guys have any thoughts on how to try to secure your publishers in some ways, because obviously there is the risk then when people move on, or they might change career paths, that you might lose a significant amount of your following or your traffic, as you said, and whether you have anything in place when you're trying to kind of mitigate against that risk.
It's a very good question. It's actually one that we've been actively talking about in the last couple of months back at the office. So I think like most things, it's helpful to have redundancy in the system. So if you're highly dependent on one editor or one marketing person, then that's probably not an ideal way to run things. So we generally try and have more than one person. Also helps if someone goes on vacation and you forgot they were going on vacation and you're like, oh, that's the only person that can tweet from this account. That's not good. So basics like that, I think, help. But one of the things that we're really thinking about and don't have the answer to, so I'd be very interested in other views on, is this, is what does the publisher own? Does the publisher own the job title of the person that's working, the editor that's working on that title? We probably own the Twitter account if it's an official product's Twitter account, but what if it's their personal Twitter account, but they name themselves as a Nature journal editor? Now, it's their personal Twitter account, but in some ways they're using the Nature name, and then if they move on, you're right, we lose that following. So there I think it is really important actually to make sure that your product accounts aren't just run by marketing, that they're partnerships between editorial and marketing and your community people if you have them, and anybody else who's interested, your technology teams. I gave a talk a little while ago and I said basically go and find the youngest people in your company and get them to tell you what you should be doing on social media, because they definitely know better than me. So I think if you can get it, basically don't spread yourself too thin, and where you have product accounts, make sure that they're a real collaborative effort. Then in general I think that gives you a buffer if people leave and move on. But it is a challenge and it's one we haven't figured out either.
Over the back.
Organizing American Institute of Physics. I've got a follow-up question to that, Grace, and that's some companies make their employees sign a special agreement on what their social media mentions and presence are, particularly when they're speaking from a company voice. So you mentioned the issue with an individual who declares themselves as a nature editor on Twitter, even though it's a personal account. Do you have such agreements yourself? And the second one, so I remember ages ago Nature was one of the first companies that really made an effort to go into Second Life. And I was wondering at what point do you decide that the return on investment for some social media activities isn't worth it anymore? At what point do you say that's enough?
Okay. So again, the agreements with editors is a very pertinent live question for us at the moment, as you might imagine, from the fact that we're still working this out. And and also a lot of our staff and editorial staff are based in the US, and that creates a whole set for from a British perspective where you're not necessarily used to the fact that you can't tell people, your employees, what you can't say, what they can and can't say, because of the freedom of speech. That you haven't written into the Constitution in the US. That creates interesting challenges for social media guidelines. I think I would say there the two that I've come across that do it really well are the BBC's social media guidelines, and they have specific guidelines for editorial staff. And NPR also has a very detailed set of social media guidelines. Both of those are freely accessible online. The short answer is, for us, it's still a work in progress, but it's something that we intend to do with our editors rather than impose it upon them, because otherwise I don't think I'll be able to get their commitment to doing it. Second question about Second Life. I was actually very involved in this project. Oh my goodness, I don't know if anybody else has tried Second Life, but trying to figure out how to move around in Second Life was I just couldn't do it. And I put it on my MacBook, and it broke my MacBook. I couldn't get it to work fast enough. We actually tried to set up, not only to run events, free to attend events in Second Life. We actually did some work to set up a conference business in Second Life. And actually, what we found is that at that time, the technology step that was required to get people, one, able to use it, and then able to competently and confidently use it, was just too big at that point. Probably if you tried to do it now, then it would probably work much better. So we tried various things. I think we tried about 3 or 4 different things, and at that point we decided that actually our efforts were better spent elsewhere. For the time being, but it's certainly not something we've ruled out, because we can still see the potential. But of course, things like Google Plus didn't, and Google Hangouts didn't exist then. You couldn't have that kind of open invitation virtual meeting in the same way that's actually very possible now, and it's video instead of avatars. So there's more options as well.
So any more questions?
Phil, I actually have a question. Oh, Grace has a question for me too. I have a question for the folks in the audience and for Phil. We started out talking about libraries, and in the end we talked about pay-per-view, which is a lot of people who access your websites are not affiliated with a research institution, so of course a pay-per-view option it makes perfect sense. My question is, have you thought about implementing or attempting to implement something like Shibboleth on a site like that, so that you could ask the person, are you affiliated with an institution? If so, go here, and use that kind of authentication to allow them then to bring them back into a subscription, as opposed to then prompting them for a payment.
And the answer is yes. Yes, we do. In actual fact, we have a product called Readcube Access, which does precisely that. It doesn't use Shibboleth, but it uses IP authentication to see that that user is from an institution that has contributed a certain drawdown account, and then they can make purchases. And we actually heard the same information about branding, about library branding, from our development partners, and we worked quite hard to put library branding into the workflow when we did it. And so yeah, that's a product that is is in active development. We have a number of development partners, and and it's going really well. It's a really cool product, and we're not the only people who are doing it. Ryan also has a product very similar to that. You have Get It Now, and there's also, I think, EBSCO is interested in a product like that. So there's several people in the industry who are working on that sort of thing. And of course, actually, token systems have been around for a while, haven't they? You know, Wiley tokens and major tokens have been around for a bit.
That's a trend, just to jump on that, that's a trend that we've been seeing in spades from our customers, both in the academic and corporate side, so I'm glad you brought it up. They see a whole spectrum of OA on one end, traditional subscriptions on the other, and then there's this sort of juggernaut in the middle.
Yeah.
Maybe it's token, maybe it's rental, maybe it's some traditional document delivery, or the more affordable Get It Now for academic services. And so the idea of libraries pushing their vendors to help straighten out those choices is worthwhile.
Should I ask my question?
Go ahead, yeah.
So my question is to Becky, and it's actually quite a nice follow-on from that one. I was really interested in what you were saying about don't make libraries choose between access and content. And I was wondering if you could expand a bit more on what you meant by that and how you would like to see publishers and libraries working together.
We see a lot of folks creating tools. Either it's data management tools, I'm thinking of one in particular because I just had to work with it last week. And this particular product was a citation management tool. And for the low price of $10,000, Bates College could license this to allow yet another option for data management. And so I think we're seeing a trend away from licensing content per se, but also mechanisms to get to and store and organize content. And it's not, I'm not making a judgment about the value of those resources, because they are very valuable in many different settings, but it's not necessarily for a certain segment of the population going to be a wise use of our dollars. So we want you to have good platforms. We want you to invest money in highly usable platforms and pathways to get to your content. But if there's going to be additional organizational layers that our users are going to see and maybe then want, but their price point is way out of our range, then that just creates more frustration from our end. Does that make sense?
Are you advocating that the tool and the content should be bundled together so that you don't have to pay extra for the tool?
It would depend on the tool, but that would be certainly something that I think the publishing and the IT community and the library community should discuss, along with the user community, because that way we'll have an idea of truly the value, the funding or the pricing models that are available, and whether or not it's worth your R&D time to invest a lot of money in that development if there really isn't a viable audience for it.
You have another question? Yeah, go ahead.
Everyone else is going to go. I'm just going to sit here and talk to Becky. I'm kidding. Becky, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you hear from your customers, your library customers, about their either frustrations with interacting with the amount of content, or how they want to be able to find it, and if you feel that's changing and if what they're looking for is changing.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think for our researchers, they have such a preset path to conducting their research that they aren't necessarily coming to the library to ask those questions. Students, on the other hand, particularly at a four-year liberal arts college, we get all sorts of really interesting and bizarre information questions. And I will be honest with you, I'm not a reference librarian. The reference and instruction folks know so much more about this area than I. But we often go to Google to start. It depends on what the information is that they're asking for. Now, Bates just implemented Summon this past year, so it's not been integrated into our teaching and our workflow per se. Penn State had it in place for a number of years before I left. In fact, I was part of implementing it there. At a large institution like a Penn State, Summon or a Discovery Service is so helpful because your ability to touch and contact and educate users is incredibly small. Penn State has 82,000 students. You just can't get to all of them. For a Bates College, we had a lot of discussion about whether or not even something like that was useful. But as a librarian, I have found it useful because often we usually aren't experts in the areas in which we're helping our students. So I think it's getting easier, but there's still, we don't know what we're missing. I think that's the final point. We just don't know what we're not even getting to at this point.
Okay, so I have a question for, I think for Grace and Ryan. So we've talked a little bit, and I kind of put a slightly opposing view to you guys, because I was talking about how to enhance the platform. Maybe it's not an opposing view, and that's kind of what this question gets to, is that I talked about enhancing the platform, and you guys talked about really kind of letting go of the need, in a sense, to have your research, to always have researchers come to the platform, to kind of take your content to where they might be. And that's something that in Recube we have done in our desktop reference manager, because it has kind of a one-click download thing. But do you think that there is a trade-off to be made between kind of letting go of that user experience and the ability to kind of monetize those eyeballs, if you like, on the platform, or is that not a real trade-off? Is that kind of a false dichotomy? And how does if there is a trade-off, how do you kind of strike that balance?
I think I'm quite a greedy person. I think the answer I would say is I want both. And I think as publishers we have to really strive to do both. And actually we're having a conversation about this again back in the office not very long ago. And a lot of our kind of ways of thinking about things were set up in the late 1990s and early 2000s in the kind of advertising revenue on your website is going to be the answer to all of your problems ever for the rest of your life. And every now and again we kind of uncover a policy that still harks back to that. And we're getting to the point now where we're like, well, that doesn't make sense anymore, so we'll just, we'll forget about that policy or that way of doing things. And actually we're as interested in having our content in other places as we are on our own site. But we also want nature.com to be an amazing place for people to come, an amazing platform for people to come and find what they're looking for, also sometimes find things they didn't know they were looking for. And that's a continual work in progress. But yes, there probably does have to be a trade-off to some degree. But I'm not a technologist, so I'll let Ryan address that.
It's a great question. I agree with your answer. So it's A or B. Do you go to where the user is, or do you enhance your site where you hope the user to arrive? I actually think the more interesting discussion is C. How do you get the user to arrive anywhere? Who are you dependent on today? And the answer far too often is Google Scholar. And my opinion is that the publishing industry has to focus on the influence that Google Scholar has on their business well ahead of trying to make this choice between enhancing your property versus putting things elsewhere on the web. And so that's why I think the idea of getting your content in more places sort of neuters the impact of Google Scholar. You aren't relying on it having to drive your users only to one destination. You can let Google or other search engines drive users to many destinations. So I guess it's all three. It's enhance your site because it's the keystone. Make sure your content's everywhere on the web, and make sure you do that in a way that takes a little bit of the power away from Google and puts it back in your hands.
Could I add 2 points to that, please? One of them is the biggest chunk of traffic to nature.com is still direct for us. So it's not coming from Google, it's not even coming from PubMed.
You are in the minority of publishers.
Google, PubMed, and other, which a lot of which I suspect is, is library websites and other services. And the second thing I wanted to say is that whenever I think about things like this, I try and think about my own behaviour as a consumer, and how I want to consume content depends on where I am, what I'm doing, what device I'm using at the time, whether I want to deep read something or whether I want to find an address very quickly. And there's nothing more frustrating than the owner of that content imposing one format on me which doesn't work for where I am. I want to be able to get it in and out sometimes. Certainly I want a mobile optimized website if I'm trying to find a map. I want you to be in Google Maps so that I can find you in Google Maps. But I also want you to be in OpenTable and all those other services. And if I think about my own behavior as a consumer and then apply that to what we should be doing as a publisher, that tells me that our own website and our own platform should be amazing, but we should also be in all of these other services, and that we will be losing customers if we're not doing that.
Okay. John Day, Royal College of Nursing and Publishing. Just coming on the Google Scholar question, we haven't really seen Google Scholar as a significant source of traffic, but we see Google, as generating 55%, between 55 and 60% of traffic to our site. And previously when I worked for Portland Press, which is a different area of, again, frequently, it's been 55 and 60% of traffic was coming from Google, and PubMed was 2%. Google Scholar 2%, Yahoo 2%, Bing 2%. So the reality is, I think for a lot of publishers, is that a huge amount of traffic is dependent on Google.
Maybe your SEO is just better than us.
I think that's a sobering reality to wrap your arms around, and I'm glad you're doing it. Nature's, you guys are very lucky because you have this enormous brand, right? And so folks will go direct, but just about every other publisher I bet has similar statistics to you. And the distinction between Scholar and Google, I think, is irrelevant. That entity, that corporation that's supposed to do no evil, has huge sway over your users. And the only way to get the upper hand is to syndicate your content.
Evan Owens, AIP Publishing, another Google story. Google Scholar can make mistakes, and we had a horrible battle with Google Scholar where they were showing us as not the publisher of our content. They were showing the aggregator that we licensed document delivery to as the publisher, and it took a year and a half of working with that other party and Google Scholar for them to get their technology straightened out to the point where in their clusters of the different sources for a given article, where we who were the publisher were showing as the publisher. But I do have a question, and that's for the pay-per-view and the other things. I mean, for those of us who have a lot of corporate business, have you any sense of the corporate implication? Is this different than for the library customer things?
So if you're talking about the what we call the Recube Access model, or the drawdown account model, it's possible to set like an academic discount, for example, because everybody who buys through that mechanism is an account holder, and you use the IP range in order to figure out who it is. So you can set, if you like, multiple price points in order to do that. That's obviously not as possible with something like a pay-per-view system where people are individually making purchases. But all we can point to is that in the trials that we've done, we've been very revenue positive. So it's and I think actually the demographics of it, they have been broadly similar, I think, to the traditional pay-per-view kind of demographics. It's just there's been just more customers. Right, so any more questions about Google? So I have one more question for Becky, actually. You talked a little bit about branding the library, and that's something that we hear a lot. It's important that services are branded for the library. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the stakes are with that? Why is it so important that libraries are branded, that we work in partnership, if you like?
It's really just a mechanism to remind. It's not even for our students, for example, because they don't look at the top and say, oh, this is brought to me by Bates or Penn State. It's really more for our administration, for them to recognize if we have to show them something, or if we have to prove to them in some sense sort of the return on investment, we can actually demonstrate, see, you started a search in Google or Google Scholar, our open linker brought you back, and see, you're back at the Bates site, and this isn't free. We're paying for this annually, and let me show you how much and so it's an opportunity for a conversation, but it makes sure that there's no question in their minds that they in fact are seeing return on the payment that they're making through the library.
Yeah. And I also wonder how analogous that is to some of the things that we have from publishers, particularly from commercial publishers who have a lot of society publishing partners, which is the need to brand, for example, PDFs when they're being acquired through mechanisms like, for example, the PubGet API or something that isn't from the platform. I guess, Grace, you're the only publisher on the platform, so can you talk a little bit about the need to its nature is a very different sort of publisher. It's not like Wiley, which is a large publisher of a lot of society journals and so forth. But you have any insight to that?
Well, I mean, we actually publish about 60 or 70
the AZ.
titles on behalf of either in partnership or on behalf of academic and society partners. And branding of PDFs remains really important, and I think will continue to be important, but not necessarily the PDF actually. Some understanding of where that content's come from, and the publication that's provided it, whether it's a file that you're viewing on your Kindle or a PDF that you're getting from a third-party platform, remains really important. And actually, I think it's important for researchers as well. It doesn't necessarily need to be the logo, but we asked researchers recently about how they choose the journal to submit to, and the number one thing they said was the reputation of the journal. And I think that readers, in fact, there have been interesting stories, case studies that show this, that readers really care about journals as well. So one is the famous story about an editorial that was co-published in about 6 different places, exactly the same editorial by the same people, and I think it was published in JAMA, and the number of citations to the JAMA editorial were something like 50 times the number of citations to, my numbers are probably completely wrong, but you get the point. So I think readers still care about brand too. I don't know, Becky, whether you want to add to that.
All the research says that that's the number one reason why people pick certain publications. It's also important because it tells the reader that this is the version of record. And that's one thing I wanted to mention when we're talking about open access and posting preprints and those things. The person who finds this version on the web isn't necessarily sure that it's the final version. And when it comes to citations and accuracy of doing their research and building upon the previous research, understanding which is the version of record really does make a difference. So branding helps create that recognition as well.
All right. Well, I think we're getting close to the end of the session at this point. So unless anybody else has any questions.
I have a very specific one, actually. It's very specific. You had your 3 mechanisms in Wiki, the sort of the rental, the personal cloud, and the word PDF.
Yep.
What's the spread like? What do people pay?
It depends who's paying. But it's certainly true that there was fear that everyone would just pick the cheapest, but that's not quite true. There's a reasonably good, and I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's a significant number of people still purchase the full price PDF, and I think that comes down to the fact that. I hate to compare us to Walmart, but it's kind of this, the kind of Walmart model of, you see a cheap toaster for $5 and you say, oh, it's $5 for a toaster, I might buy that. And then you go in and you have a look at it and you say, oh, this toaster is actually not quite what I need, it doesn't work quite the way I want to. And then there's one next to it for $20 and say, oh, okay, because you're engaged in that thought process of what's of value to you, you're actually more likely to spend $20 on a toaster even though you weren't going to spend $20 on a toaster 10 minutes ago, So just engaging people, and saying, there are a bunch of options, makes them more likely to purchase at pretty much any price point. And so we get a significant number of people who are purchasing at the full price point. The data on Nature, actually, I suppose that's the one thing I can point to off the top of my head, is that the number of purchases through the traditional pay-per-view system actually went up. During 2013, rather than down. So there is they don't behave the way you might, intuitively think that they would just all, buy the cheap version. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming, and thanks for sticking out to the bitter end. Thanks to all the panelists and to Ben for being our shepherd. See you tomorrow.